Welcome to the Tour on Air podcast. Today I'm here with Josh Giegel, co-founder and CEO of Virgin Hyperloop. Josh, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Niko, for having me.
And I want to start out, there's lots of ground to cover today, but would love to start out sort of with your own personal journey. You were at SpaceX before, you worked in the energy field before. Tell us a little bit about like sort of the early stages of thinking about this idea. I know that at least I read that you weren't all too fond of the white paper first time you read it. What was your journey like?
So it's a good one. So I'm a son of two engineers. My mom and dad are both engineers, and then my wife, my sister's husband, everybody's an engineer now. So I'll say it's about as cliched as you can possibly get. But the opportunity to really learn how to become an engineer at SpaceX, and then kind of moving into a rocket knowledge, learning how to go from grad school into actually being a practicing engineer, that was really, I'll say, beneficial to learn how to build rocket engines, to do it quickly, do it cheaply, and the like. And then really started to get excited about kind of sustainable technology development. And that was going to a company called EcoGen, where we took anything that was hot and we made more power from it. And that was really this kind of first spot of like, what can we do? What can we focus on that will actually make an impact here on Earth? I think it's become a little bit more, I'll say, near to home over the last 2 years since we've had a little kid. And, when you look at him and like, what's it going to be like in 20, 30, 40 years from a sustainability standpoint? But when I saw the initial white paper for Hyperloop, it was sort of like, oh, okay, just another kind of in a long line of technology of transportation ideas, right? And what I didn't see the first time I read it, didn't feel, was I'll say the latent desire for something new, right? There's so much around us from a transportation space that's actually pretty old. I don't use computers from like the 1980s, so I would be surprised that I would use transportation from like the 1880s. And that opportunity to build something new, to build something a bit transformative, started to grab my attention. And the white paper didn't capture all of that, I think, in its full kind of glory, if you will. There were some challenges with the technology that was described in there, and it is that little bit of naivete, but also that little bit of excitement that makes you say like, oh, I think I can design something better than that. And that's really what started making me think a little bit more about the transportation space in general. And then ultimately, what got me really excited about it was that A, nobody had done it. B, it was going to be hard enough to be fun. And then C, it was going to be around long after we were gone. And that sort of like big idea, no one's done something like this before, plus the legacy aspect, all became like really, really exciting to quit my job and go start. So it was about as romantic of a initial period as you can, pure ideas and, going to a garage, putting your job and just trying to make it happen.
So we have the romance, but you did leave out the vision quest. You want to expand, sort of your vision quest in actually taking that step and making this your life's work now?
Yeah, it was about in 2013, late 2013, I had gone on a backpacking trip in the middle of winter, and we were back in Ohio, and there was this thing we call the polar vortex, which ended up being one of the coldest backpacking trips I've ever been on. And during that, we had a number of I'll say exciting things to experiment with, and it was sort of in that part where you kind of, at that time I was about 29. Or 28, I should say, and was really looking at what would it take to do something like, what do I want to do with my career? Do I want to keep working on stuff that other people have had? Do I want to keep following kind of these other ideas, or do I want to try something on my own? I've always had this idea of trying something on my own. I had a number of ideas, but none of them could really, I'll say, get me excited enough to quit what I was doing. And it was on that time where I was just talking to a couple of friends where we were just talking about the future and like, what is your skill set? How could you contribute to the future? How could you do all that? And I realized like, I'm a technologist, right? Like I'm not going to be a politician. I'm not going to be someone who's, like an actor or a social influencer or anything like that. My gift is technology. And what I wanted to do was create something short, succinct, that would be like memorable to be a driving force for my life. And after we came back from that, I actually wrote it down and went through like a lot of iterations, just going back and forth, and arrived at something pretty succinct, which was, I will change the world through the technology I build. And so like each point, each word in that was chosen pretty carefully, like will versus want, because I really believe I can do it. Change the world is, I'll say, not a town, a state, because it's like the scale of what I'm trying to achieve. And then through the technology kind of just says what I am, right? I'm a technologist. I'm not a politician or a writer or anything like that. And the last part is a big one for me. Through the technology I build. And so building is a key thing. And that was a big differentiation point for me leaving grad school, was like, I wanted to be a builder. I didn't want to be a kind of a pontificator or an academic. I wanted to do it through action and through build. And that's really the driving force. So I would change it through world to the technology I build. And the one modification I've made in really the last 2 to 3 years has been embracing the fact that we have a big team here, and that it takes a team that truly, like, the I in those two statements is a little too like constraining, a little too limiting, right? Because there's only so much a single person can do, but there's a lot that we can do. And then I think in a little bit more of a transcendental way, becoming a dad also modified it a little bit, which is like, if he does it, my son, is that good enough? Like, if I've created the environment and the forum for him to go do it, to be something more than I could ever be, is that something that's also okay? And I got okay with that over the course of the last like 2 years, but that was the goal. And what we're doing here at Hyperloop is just that. Like, we're trying to change the way we move, the way that we live, how we can make transportation sustainable, but through building it, through actual action of taking the steps to actually bring this into reality.
And before we go down, sort of exploring the product a little bit, the changes to the original white paper and some of the early successes and challenges you experienced, just since you were saying sort of you after this vision quest or this backpacking trip, you knew you wanted to build technology. Did you envision becoming the CEO of a company? Because also, like, talking to a lot of builders and product folks out there, that transition to CEO often takes them a little bit away from building. So I wonder, how you feel your role evolved, and how you can be satisfied or fully fulfilled in sort of the managerial part of being a CEO now.
That's a fantastic question. I mean, it was one that, I think I struggled with a number of years ago, which is like, where do you derive the most amount of happiness, enjoyment, but also like this, in the US, we have this term called the Peter principle, right? Where people kind of move to an area of their least effectiveness. But the thing I've really become to embrace about the leadership role is that transition into, how do you enable a team to realize more than the individual, right? And so how are you inspiring? How are you leading? How are you directing a group of people to do something that maybe in some cases you can't, because it's a skill set you don't have, but it's part of a better overall product that you're trying to do. And I think what became really interesting about this is the beginning parts of the company were all kind of the idea part, I'll say ideating on how do you take that white paper, how do you evolve it to something that could be economically viable, and all those other pieces, and call it that exploratory phase of doing that. And then once you kind of set this product, this idea of a dumb tube smart pod that we've created, from a number of years ago, as you go down and executing that, what you start to realize is that the specialization that's required in each of the different areas, we're basically building the airport, the airplane, the air traffic control, and the sky at the same time. And you start to have to find different people who are really good at each one of those areas. And then what you start to see is that, how can you create a better product than you had envisioned by allowing those individuals to be, as good as they possibly can? So creating the environment, facilitating the environment to actually be more innovative, to be more, I'll say, exploratory, to come up with the better ideas. And that's been, I think, it's been simultaneously one of the biggest challenges, but also one of the more rewarding things is that the pressure of one person having to come up with all the ideas Now is, I'll say, the opportunity for everybody to come up with something that could be better than what we started with. And creating that environment, that fostering that environment is something that's become pretty passionate for me itself. And I think the other aspect is, when you have that idea, you have the vision, you're trying to push it forward, you do want to become a protector of that in a way, right? There's all kinds of distractions, all kinds of things Hyperloop could be. And the question is that what we want it to be? And then you have to basically drive the focus and drive the attention of the company so that you're not being distracted by all these different things that could occur. And that's been, I think, one of the more interesting pieces is that there's probably infinitely many ways that this will fail and only a couple of ways that it will succeed. And trying to navigate and steer, I think, is it. And really, when you start to see what my skill sets are versus what I thought they were maybe a couple of years ago, I would kind of describe myself as there's a number of different people on the face of the earth. There's cartographers, there's explorers, and there's this idea of people who kind of follow the routes, and you need some combination of each. And the part that I really like is this explorer cartographer, where you're basically creating the map out of nothing, and you're creating sound out of silence or something out of nothing. And this idea of saying, how do we get to that end state, which I can see and I can articulate, but how do we select the right one of these paths? That's become a game, a challenge that's been inordinately difficult, but also very, very rewarding.
There's also sort of the give and take, I guess, categorization of sort of the workplace. And just lastly, on sort of your role and the learnings that you personally been on in your journey. There's famously been a lot of tumult in your company with sort of Bam Brogan and Pishavar, early founders or co-founders, clashing, lots of lawsuits. What would you advise somebody else, or maybe what were your own personal learnings in being in the midst of that? Like, what is it that then propelled you to lead this company where others clearly failed?
It's a good one. It was, there was that, we talked about that romanticism of starting a company, right? And where you talk about, oh, we'll be a company of 200 or 300 people, and you write that down on a whiteboard, and you look at sort of the opportunities that it means. And what I think we failed to realize, and what I know I failed to realize, is that 200, 300 people, and then investors and everything like that, they're just that, they're people. And the people, each have their own, I'll say, driving force, reasons for being here, reasons for excitement, reasons for fear. And I think I know me, and I'll speak for myself, I can't speak for anybody else here. I think I personally underestimated the amounts of effort it takes to lead a group of people, right? And you kind of have this romantic vision that the best product in the world will just inspire everybody to go and work on that. But I've really learned, and I think sometimes the hard way, and like that people have a variety of driving forces. And sometimes the exact same stimuli can lead to a different result. And even very, very recent, or within like 1 week, same thing might happen versus the next week, and you have a completely different result. And really, I think the challenge has been, how do you translate a good engineer, which I am / got how I got here, into somebody who's a good leader. And I think there's whenever you're starting a company, there's always a little of ego involved. I mean, if you kind of abstract yourself for a moment and you say, like, why do you think you will succeed when everybody else has failed? Like, there has to be some degree of maybe lack of humility, for a better word, or narcissism, or whatever you want to say, to do that. And with that, I think there comes a certain type of personality. Like, I can be a super intense, a super passionate person, and sometimes that can spoil or spill over into other aspects. It sometimes affects my home life and the like. And you start to get all those things that are needed for people to take that first step. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it turns into a little bit of a chemical mixture. But the thing that became really interesting is that the people's, I'll say, innermost way of being actually comes to the forefront, and you see that really quickly, and you see people who care about the organization, tremendously, who maybe don't manifest it in the same way, and that can lead to a lot of heartache and headache. And for us at the beginning, I just don't think, I think the hype around Hyperloop created this almost like insurmountable like momentum that was going, and there was just this pressure to go. We'd raised a lot of money very, very quickly. It
almost
cost,
500 million, correct?
yeah, and it pushed and it pushed and it pushed. And there's times where it feels, if you've ever been skiing before and you've gone down a hill you just weren't quite ready for, that type of feeling where you're holding on, you're in the back seat on your skis a little bit, and you're not forward. And then you just have to like flip the mindset. You have to get it forward. You have to, I'll say coalesce everything that's around you, focus on what matters, and then actually just go and do. And I think where we found solace is when you can kind of push the noise out and you can just go build, you can go execute, whether it's, building the Hyperloop or doing the passenger test that we did, or building the next generation of the technology. Like if I find myself ever being a little too distracted, it's like come back to center, and we're a company that's centered around building. And sometimes when we've gotten into some wayward areas, we've forgotten that a little bit.
And speaking of governance, like how involved is Branson now, Richard Branson, in this? Is this like a sparring partner for you?
It's Virgin has been pretty good. So it's been Richard, it's been a number of other groups inside of Virgin that have been really helpful. So, from Virgin Galactic to Virgin Trains to Virgin Atlantic to they're offering a whole host of Virgin family of products there, or product lines, I should say. And so we've been able to tap that experience to help us with certain aspects of the business, whether it's a safety review for the passenger test that we did last fall, or it's how do your train operations work, because we're optimizing our system to learn from some of the operating principles of these other areas, all the way to, talking to Richard about, how do you view X, Y, and Z, and kind of being that sparring partner, like you said, if you will, like this is an idea that I've got, how do you feel about that? But they've been a really, I'll say, a creative sounding board for us to bounce ideas and iterate back and forth with, to create, I think, what's been a really exciting passenger experience that we've put together over the last really year plus.
And he comes across as somebody, I mean, just from the outside, that could have a soothing effect on kind of the turmoil of maybe the early history of the company and creating a great culture to build. Yeah,
and I think that one of the so in my brief before starting this company, I was actually at Virgin Galactic for only about 6 months. It was really kind of what's now Virgin Orbit, so it was kind of like the early founding team for that. And when I left, I know Richard and the group were like, well, where are you going? What are you doing? And I wasn't telling anybody what I was doing at that point. And so there's this kind of innate curiosity. And about 2.5 years later, in the middle of 2017, when they invested and Richard came out to our test site, there was a little bit of this, the prodigal son has returned type of deal. But I distinctly remember a meeting where we were sitting in this kind of very cheap motel outside of Mojave when I was meeting with him for something a couple of years ago. And, one of these like in very, very cheap motels, and there's one of these like breakfast nooks, right? And so I was meeting Richard there for breakfast, and it's kind of like the bagels are in this like plastic container and everything. And so Richard and he's got his feet up on the chair next to him. And so him and I are sitting there having breakfast at this super cheap motel talking about the future of transportation with Hyperloop. And I just remember this feels like something that I won't forget for quite some time. So, but yeah, just a really, a very positive, very bubbly guy. Yeah. Just someone who's internationally recognizable initially anywhere. Sure. And that power, the power that came with that, I think is something that it's been inspiring to watch, to see like how he's built, his brand from basically nothing.
So let's talk product. You had your first passenger travel experiment in November of last year. You were part of it. The earliest concepts are from the early 20th century, correct? And then it sort of took a while, and then Elon Musk famously wrote that white paper. Can you give us maybe just a brief evolution of the product and where you at right now?
So the one of the things I've been always finding these different articles. So the closest thing was there was a steam train back in London in like 1848 that would be propelled down this tube, and I guess it ended up not working because rats kept eating these leather seals, like sealing devices that they had at the time. So that was kind of the early one. Then it progressed through a couple of like almost Orwellian style ideas and Art Deco style ideas in the early 1900s. And then I'll say the closest thing to what we're working on today was this paper in the 70s by a company called the Rand Corporation. So their idea was really an electromagnetic train inside of a tube, a low pressure tube. And that eventually evolved and worked its way over into really a couple of other, there was the Swiss.
Transrapid?
Yeah, no, that was their kind of maglev train. There was one that was a Swiss, the name is just escaping right now. It's basically a Swiss, low pressure Swiss tunnel. Back in like the mid aughts, so between like 2005, 2010 type of deal. And it was really kind of taking some of the technology that's like the Transrapid and others were using and just putting it inside of a low pressure tube. Then ultimately the white paper came out and was talking about air bearings and compressors on the front and a whole host of other things. And when you just looked at the way that the white paper was working, like the energy consumption with this big compressor, like there's barely any air in the tube, and yet you're trying to compress it to go around the tube. It's just really energy intensive, adds a lot of complexity. And then air bearings, to give you an idea, was the white paper was talking about air bearings, which are a known entity or known technology, except that they only work with either a lot of air, a lot of energy, or really, really small gaps. So think less than a credit card thickness of a gap, which you just can't maintain as you go, very long distances, especially at high speeds. And taking that pretty quickly into the company, like in the first 6 months, we decided that magnetic levitation was going to be the way to go, and that electromagnetic propulsion was going to be able to do this. And we built the first prototype system out in Vegas, the one that's kind of artificially behind me right now, using that technology, a trackside technology, right? Where the vehicle is pretty dumb, track is very smart, and that allows you to go. And another one of my pseudo vision quests, this just happened to be a bike ride in early 2017, was I was riding up the hills in the Santa Monica Mountains here, and I noticed a 1933 Ford Roadster turning around this bend. And it was kind of this moment where in the midst of being completely out of breath, chugging up this hill, I realized that like, how crazy is that that car is almost 100 years old and yet it's still driving on the same road today. And so started to really think about why that is and why that exists and why roads are so ubiquitous around us. And it's this idea of a dumb road, smart car, right? So that same road that the 33 Ford or a Model T could drive on, a Model 3 could drive on today. And it's the simplicity, it's that all the smarts rely on the vehicle. And that most importantly, there's no moving parts. Like if there was every time you want to get off at an off-ramp, if the off-ramp had to move, you would think that that's pretty crazy, but yet that's what happens with trains. And so how are we going to design a system that would allow us to do that, but just for our type of system? So what we ended up looking at was putting everything on the vehicle, miniaturizing it, having to develop new maglev technology, new propulsion technology, and really kind of go back to the drawing board in 2017. And we were able to do that and develop all these new technologies over the last about 4 years. And the goal here was to put everything on the vehicle. And we've been able to successfully do that. At the same time, we've been looking at how do you make this whole system safe, right? So before we did the test in November of last year, the only type of people that would be in this environment are wearing like a full spacesuit, right? Whether they're going up, whether they're in an aircraft, whether it's Felix Baumgartner jumping off of his Red Bull balloon, whatever it might be. And so we had to design a system that could be safe for us just wearing normal clothes. And that was a challenge in and of itself, how to actually go through, use an independent safety assessor to make this safe. So effectively what we've done in the last 4 years is, I'll say, make a smart pod, dumb tube, and integrate everything into a brand new, like high power, long range electric autonomous vehicle.
And what would be sort of your, let's say, answer to some of the critique that's been out there? Some people saying, well, the speed wasn't really, all that great, considering, the speeds that we see, with the China's CRH3 or the Korean Railroad, Korail, which had much greater speed with, being able also to host a lot more passengers. Like in what way do you think like Hyperloop will be able to far exceed what we currently have in some of the systems around the world?
So we'll call it 6.5 years out of the garage here. And so, it's a big task, right? There is huge amounts of incumbency with regard to these other technologies. But what we've created and what we've tested so far, I think, show that this is something that could be substantially more beneficial in the long run. So when you look at our system, the passenger test that we did, yes, we have a 500-meter long tube in Las Vegas. That's not kilometers long, right? It's 500 meters. We've got that up to about 390 kilometers an hour in some of the tests that we've done. Our rigs, the development of this new levitation propulsion, we've gone all the way up to the speeds that we would actually see. So 800, 900, 1,000 kilometers an hour on these small scale systems, prototypes, I would say. And now what we're doing is combining all of those into a 28 passenger vehicle, the commercial version of this vehicle. And that's where we'll just need length of track. Really, the only thing separating us from going to these speeds is us getting, X amount of kilometers of track to be able to do that. So that's what we're working on right now, actually combining and putting the system together into a 28 passenger vehicle. So upgrading from learning from the 2-passenger vehicle that we did the test with, and then going to that bigger one. And I'll say the system is actually quite a bit different. I mean, I think the thing I like to tell people is, like, if you think this is just a faster train, I'm sorry, but you're going to be sadly mistaken, because it's a lot more than just that. And when you look at our system, what we're trying to do, what we're going for, is holistically a much reduced time to total transit experience, but also one that's significantly less emitting, less polluting than a bunch of others. So if I describe to you the experience, you show up when you want to show up. This idea of having a set timetable, that's something of yesteryear. You get on a vehicle that goes directly to your destination with about 25 to 28 other passengers. It doesn't stop at every place along the way. It can leave. You can form these, what we call virtual convoys. So they're not mechanically coupled together like a rail car are. They're sort of like trucks on a road. And so if I'm here in the US and I'm leaving Washington, D.C., the first 3 vehicles could be going to Boston. The next 4 could be going to New York, and the next 2 to Philadelphia. And they just, as we mentioned, there's no moving parts. So they just peel off as they get close to those destinations. So you're having a much reduced wait time. You're having a much, I'll say, improved much higher average speed. And ultimately, you're able to do this quite a bit faster than, I'll say, any other mode, whether it's high-speed rail, whether it's air. And when it comes to the sustainability aspect, it's fully electric, it's fully autonomous. And then most importantly, you're doing that for about 10 times less energy consumption than an aircraft. And you're going, I'll say, substantially, it's taking substantially less time to do that.
And what about the sort of onboard experience? Is that more like an EasyJet or Spirit, or more like a Pan Am of the 60s?
I would say somewhere between the middle, right? We want a couple of things. We want this to be affordable. We want this to be something that is available to the masses. So most of these type of things would be on the order of a plane ticket. You're not going to have something that's a much higher end experience, like a much more expensive experience like an Uber X or an Uber Black, or even some of these eVTOLs, because that means we limit the amount of people who can afford to ride the system. Ultimately, that means we're less impactful. We make less revenue for the operators and the like. So for the people getting on, you're going to have, I'll say, a much more seamless ticketing experience. There won't be this waiting aspect. There won't be, I'll say, the Pan Am experience of the 60s, as nostalgic as it looks. We won't have kind of that level of waiter or service or flight attendant, whatever you want to say in there. But it'll be something that has, say, uniquely this century and beyond. So whether it's Wi-Fi connectivity, whether it's last mile connectivity, whether it's basically being able to integrate into some of the other services where you may have the ability to, and we've talked about with some architects, like this idea of kind of on demand, like a beverage or something like that you can pick up, that like, hey, when I'm getting on, I like my coffee blank, blank, blank. And it's there sort of at the vehicle as you walk into the vehicle, right? Those type of experiences that would exist for people. But it's going to be an autonomous experience. It's going to be one that allows you, I'll say it's intuitive experience, one that gets you where you want to be. And then when you've seen some of the passenger videos that we've done, it's a pretty open concept. It's something that gives us a high degree of flexibility to actually adapt interiors to like the US or to India or to Europe, wherever we might be. You can adapt those interiors to be able to fit the local market that you're trying to serve.
And what role will governments play? I mean, I'm from Germany, as you can tell, you know, highly regulated. I mean, it's hard to even get like, you know, the allowance to put a fiber optics cable. So in Germany, I can't picture this happening. And we've seen the transfer rate also fail spectacularly in Germany. What countries, what territories? I saw a few letters of intent. I think Estonia that you have, or Latvia. I'm not sure which of the countries it was, but you know, what countries do you think are really open to that type of innovation? And what role will grants and subsidies, etc., play? And also maybe, you know, a few words on the new infrastructure plan that Biden presented and how that all ties together for you.
No, great question. So I'll say the easiest way for us to enter the market is kind of coming through one of two areas. One is there's a huge amount of need, or there's a huge amount of desire. And so the need is either the current modes of transportation are saturated or non-existent. And then two, from a desire standpoint, is the desire to kind of either leapfrog technologies, to invest in a new technology that will provide a better level of service or get some of the green credentials that you're looking at. So when you look at places like India, those are areas where the infrastructure is kind of saturated already. They're looking to improve the connectivity, looking to reduce time. So for example, like Mumbai to Pune, about 120 kilometers right now. On a good day, it's like 4 or 5 hours by car, I'll call it slow train. And with the Hyperloop, that's something like 20 minutes. And so you can move, you know, 150, 200 million passengers a year on that type of system. So that's one that's, you know, I'll say a high level of desire because systems are at capacity. In areas like the Middle East, or some of, I'll say, the less, I don't want to say the fringe European companies, but just like the edge European companies that don't have the rail connectivity yet. They're looking for that next type of connectivity, right? And they don't have existing infrastructure yet. And so they're looking at putting in infrastructure. Now they're trying to make a choice. Do I put in a rail? Do I put in a road? Do I put in a Hyperloop? Do I put in this? And so those, I think, are your kind of two low-hanging fruit in terms of places that you could do some of these projects relatively quickly. But what I think has been really interesting over the last year is the push for sustainability. Is particularly if you look at France, and I know Germany's considering as well, this ban on short haul flights, right? And the rationale is that those are pretty heavily emitting compared to the level of service. So they're trying to drive people onto a more sustainable mode of transport.
Companies doing that, right? Like, yeah, as guidelines for their employees.
Yeah. And so when you start to say like, okay, well, what's that going to mean for like us as humans, as connectivity? You know, I'll say like my observation is kind of throughout the history of time, like as a civilization, we've moved forward as we move faster, right? So roads, ships, aircraft, you know, as we connect people more and more together, the faster that we're connected, overall, the better the economic growth, idea flow, and all that other stuff. And when you look at what's going on, like I super applaud this idea of, you know, focusing in on sustainability. But what's that going to mean for the end user? Is it going to take longer? Is it going to be more inconvenient? Are we going to regress in a way? And so that's where the opportunity for Hyperloop, I think, becomes really, really interesting. This this notion of like sustainability without sacrifice, right?
Mhm.
So when you look in the US at Biden's Build Back Better plan, you look at how do you connect people meeting the needs of this century, which is like sustainable, and then you want the on-demand, you want the high-speed aspect. And when you see the I'll say the ecosystem of technology that can do that, there's really not a lot out there. We've kind of seen the limits of rail, we've seen the limits of aircraft, we've seen the limits of cars, obviously. Now going to electric cars, going to autonomous cars, those will help, but we still care about the total time it's going to take. So how do we continue to push forward without having all of this time regression, if you will? Mm-hmm. And that's where I think the sentiment has actually dramatically changed. I thought you might not see this for another 5 years, in the mid 2020s, but the pandemic, I think, with less congestion, with cleaner air, our friends in India could see the Himalayas from Delhi now, and something they hadn't seen for like 30 years. So how can we recreate, I'll say, those experiences, but also give people the opportunities that they want? And I think you're starting to see a desire for high-speed rail, or what people think is high-speed rail in the US. And you're saying like, well, all right, well, what are we going to do? Are we going to invest in something that we already know the limits of? Or are we going to put in this new type of infrastructure that will give us the opportunity to be, relevant in 30, 40, 50, even 100 years, because the pods just keep updating, and I'm not investing in all this, I'll say, outdated infrastructure. I'm investing in kind of future infrastructure that can continue to grow. So I think there's a much, much, much larger, I'll say, attraction even than 2 years ago, because of the push for sustainable transport, and then the action that we're definitely starting to see take place in Europe, and I hopefully start to see here in the US. And I think there is a big chance here with the Biden infrastructure plan to get in there and show that this technology is ready to move to that next level, which is, undertaking national transformation.
I mean, I certainly hope so, because the regress, we've seen it in transportation so many times before, right? Considering that we're flying now from Europe to the US slower than we've ever had before, right? We used to, not only be able to fly faster with the Concorde, but even just general commercial planes used to choose to fly faster. So I guess a lot of it has to do with ultimately cost efficiency, right? And you, I guess, are bullish that Hyperloop will be competitive on a cost efficiency basis.
Yeah, and when you look at, it's really, astute, like the point that you're out there. So one of the examples I like to talk about is the Silk Road, One Belt, One Road initiative that's occurring, in China right now. The amount of money that's being put into upgrading that infrastructure, and you kind of look at the average speed on that rail corridor right now is something like 30 or 40 kilometers an hour. They're investing tens of billions, if not low hundreds of billions, to improve that average speed on that corridor to about maybe 80 to 100 kilometers an hour. You just think about that a moment. They're willing to make that level of investment for a 3 or 4x type of change. Like, we could do a 30x type of change. And now, instead of taking 6 weeks by boat to get to Europe from China, or a couple of weeks via rail, you're looking at less than a day. You can be moving things around. So the utilization of this system is so much higher. Not to mention that you're basically getting the speed of an aircraft, that connectivity enhancement, for the cost of really a truck, and for the emissions, far less than the emissions of an aircraft and the like. And that's really, I think, the opportunity that we see, and that if people are willing to really invest in and get to that next level, I think it's going to provide connectivity in a way that, even supersonic point to point is going to be still very energy intensive. You look at even like suborbital point to point, like, you're never going to be moving goods like that. And that's going to be for a certain type of people. It's not going to be for, Johnny Everyman.
So, yeah, I mean, we shouldn't we don't have to go now all political. I have so many other questions, but I guess from a European perspective, a lot of it, will, I guess, have to do with America's willingness to tolerate tax increases, right? And whether Biden's approach here, will be as popular as FDR's, or whether there's going to be a backlash in a few years again. I want to maybe just also briefly talk to you about sort of, how Hyperloop fits into the overall climate discussion, and maybe if you can share some data points with us, about the opportunity of, that sort of technology really having, a big impact on our climate and on our carbon footprint.
So this one is really personal, I think, to me. It's one of the things, I'd left the rocket industry to move kind of into this sustainable technology piece. And the things I really like about our system, first, we're moving about as many people, moving 50, 60,000 passengers per direction per hour. Just to give you a sense of scale, that's the equivalent throughput of a 30-lane highway. So when you start to think about like, wow, that's a lot of capacity that you're putting in, especially in effectively a two-way tube, that gives you a much reduced footprint for the amount of capacity that you're looking at. When you look at how do you actually install this, we can climb steeper hills, we can take tighter turns, we use less right of way. It's quiet, right? We're inside of a tube. It's not like it's a train blaring past your backyard. You have, I'll say, a much higher ability to deal with you're able to deal with weather in a more robust way. You don't have the number one, I'll say, leading cause of accidents with trains, which are at grade crossings and things that could involve and get across the track, whether it's camels in the Middle East or people in Europe or cars or whatever it might be. Those things all go away. And just looking at the raw kind of physics of it, we take most of the air out of the tube. It'd be like flying at about 50 kilometers of altitude, right? So that allows you to go to the speed of an aircraft for about 10 to 15 times less drag. So that's where there's big amount of energy savings. The magnetic levitation, the propulsion systems that we've developed over the last couple of years, tested, had independently verified, they're about 10 times more efficient than any of the other maglev systems out there, and they're about 50% more efficient from a propulsion standpoint than any other system out there. So putting that all together, we've got a really energy efficient vehicle. And so we're going the speed of an aircraft, but for about 10 times less energy consumption, which is a huge saving point. When you look at the actual construction of the tube itself, right, we're doing this we're trying to do this as modularized as possible. So what does that mean is that it's a concrete tube. You're minimizing, I'll say, field operations. You're doing that automated. You're making a lot of these segments in precast yards. So if you're making things in precast yards, you have the ability to much more easily, more easily, you're able to capture, you're able to at least have the potential to capture, able to, I'll say, invest in technologies that can reduce the emissions for cement manufacturing or for steel manufacturing, because you're doing that in more of a manufacturing sense as opposed to just splayed out across the landscape itself. So what we're looking at targeting is you'll be able to, within a couple of years of building a whole system, the operations of the system would more than pay back all of the emissions of actually building the system of itself. So that it basically would be something that could be, I'll say, very, very low carbon footprint within a couple of years of its initial construction, and certainly from its operation. That could further be reduced when you start to incorporate like green concrete, green steel into the mix, and then ultimately being able to incorporate the renewables into the power generation, whether it's solar, whether it's hydrogen, whether it's wind. And our vehicles are battery powered, so that means they have a lot of life. They can basically modulate what's going on from the grid side of the fence. So all in all, when we compared this to, I'll say, internal combustion engine vehicles or aircraft today, we're looking at about 4%, the current greenhouse gas emission levels of those modes of transportation, despite going at the speed of an aircraft. And that's what I think is really exciting. When you look at Paris, when you look at the climate accords that are coming from there, they're targeting like a 30% reduction by 2030, 2050 type of deal. And I think 30% is really the bare minimum. It's like the absolute minimum that we need to do. So we should be investing in technologies that enable us to far exceed that, because on balance, we need to get to 30%. So we need to be investing in things that are already significantly more energy efficient and less carbon intensive today. That way, some of the other areas that are harder to change, they can basically take a little bit more time so that on average we get to where we need to be.
And that time horizon, 2030, 2040, is that something that you sort of see feasible as, Hyperloop really being ready and impactful? Like, tell us maybe a little bit about your next milestones and when will, the first passengers really be able to enjoy a ride like this?
Yeah. So the goal for us over the course of the next 5 years is to go from, the passenger test that you saw today to the commercial variant of this, and get that independently safety approved, which means we can actually kind of deploy that throughout the world, because that becomes a little bit of a passport, if you will, with all of these regulators around the world, because that's the process that they currently use, whether it's rail in Europe right now or aircraft in other parts of the world. They all use this kind of independent safety assessor. And that's what we did on the test before. That's the way we're doing it. So by the middle part of this decade, the commercial version of the technology that we'll have will be ready to go from that. And then it'll be about how quickly we can build out. So we have a lot of automation tools, a lot of software tools to do project planning a heck of a lot faster. And then ultimately to be able to deploy projects faster. So I think you're going to see by the end of this decade, which I would say is the decade of Hyperloop, starting with 2 people in, having hundreds of millions ride by the end, you're going to be looking at probably at least on the order of maybe 6 projects around the world that'll be in operation in some form or another, and then kind of growing pretty steadily after that we would be, substantial, I'd say low hundreds of kilometers by the end of this decade with, maybe six projects or something on that order. And then in the 2030s, 2040s, that's where you're going to see kind of an explosion of growth. And I wouldn't be surprised if you would, see in the order of thousands of kilometers by the 2040 type of time frame, provide everything is successful. And the thing that I think is pretty interesting is that by 25, 26, as we're getting these commercial operations beginning to go forward, we've only been a company that was just out of the garage about 10 years from that point. And so if you look at sort of the things that are around us, SpaceX, Blue Origin, you've got Virgin Galactic, and you're looking at companies that are making technology products for passengers, astronaut level passengers in like 18 or 20 years. We're going from a garage to grandma's in about 10. And so it's a pretty steep climb, and we're climbing it as quickly as we can. But it's also, I think, a very ambitious, because to your point, you go like, if we're only have one project by the end of this decade, we're not making the dent that we need to in the climate side of the fence. We're not impacting as many people as we want to impact. We're not, I would say I'm not changing the world through the technology I build. If there's one 30-kilometer project somewhere in the world, I want there to be, a number of those and then connecting into bigger and bigger ones. So, but I think the biggest challenge is like, people are a bit technology adverse. So how do you show them that this product is safe? That's why we did the test last year. How do you show them this is cost effective? That's why we're building the technology right now. And then how do you show people that they're willing to do that? That's the government engagement that we're getting around the world, that like, hey, we're taking this seriously. We want to consider this. You just got to keep delivering on what you've been delivering on and do it quickly. But they're seeing the response is that they see this happening, in the next 5 to 10 years, not the next 15 to 20, because if it was 15 to 20, people wouldn't be talking to us.
I mean, that's already a great closing statement, but just two more questions. One that I ask everybody on the podcast, which is sort of about pivoting versus iterating, which in sort of the early stage startup world is a decision that every founder has to do often. And, I'm looking sort of for mental frameworks that founders have or leaders have in making that decision, whether to iterate or to pivot. Your product, obviously, I mean, maybe you have, even come to the point of, should we go for a totally different technology because you have a life's mission and there's probably multiple ways of making a dent, but probably rather less pivoting than in some of the early stage software companies. But, talk a little bit about, then the process of iteration and making that decision, when to really go kind of nitty gritty and try to improve in the detail versus, you know, taking larger detours?
So we did one pretty big pivot, and that was in early 2017, where really took this decision: do we want to keep building everything on the track side or on the tube side, or do we want to move to putting everything in the vehicle, right? And those are two very, very different type of products. And it was the pivot was not without, I'll say, quite a bit of pushback and quite a bit of danger. I remember distinctly coming back from that bike ride, where I was like saw the car, did everything there, and coming back into the office that following Monday and saying, I think we need to put everything on the pod. And I can tell you the ranges of responses from my team were, you're crazy, to that's the stupidest idea I've ever heard, to this will never work. And I said, well, if it'll never work, the math will tell us it'll never work, right? So there's always a little bit of beauty in physics that, you know, it's brutal, but predictable. And so that change was a tough one, right? Because at the time, when we did the math, it actually came out more favorably than my team kind of thought, that, hey, it was about apples to apples. And that was in 2017. And then you had to make a little bit of an intuition call. And the intuition call for me was, you see the world around us moving to electric vehicles. You see the investments in batteries. You see the investments in these type of what I'd say vehicle-based technologies. And I said, that's, if we can leverage that momentum, if we can leverage that knowledge, that I'll say ecosystem and supply chain, we're going to be able to drive the cost of our product down further. So if they're on par today, I can guarantee you they won't be on par in 5 or 10 years. And it took that sort of like that final intuition-based decision to say, we're going to put everything on the vehicle. But it was, you have to stick to your beliefs for a little bit until kind of proven otherwise. And the team did a really good job analyzing both sides of the fence, and it made the decision still not black and white. It was like, it's a 50-50 call in 2017, but I think it's a call that was the right call now, because otherwise I think you're going to just have a cost prohibitive system and it's not going to work. So that pivot is, what's the rest of the industry doing? What are the trends that you're seeing? How is your product going to be affected by those trends, and really try to develop some ethos, so modular, upgradable, future-proof for those three things. So if something's old or something is broken, it's redundant. If something is old and obsolete, I upgrade it. And if something is better, whether it's like superconductors or high temperature superconductors or graphene or whatever, or solid state batteries, I incorporate it. And I don't have to redesign my whole infrastructure. And to me, that felt like the right, nature-based solution, that simplicity was the way to go.
And then lastly, how do you go about your work week? When you were talking about sort of, you being a builder at heart and now transforming into a manager, a leader, I had to think of this essay. I don't know if you've come across it, by the founder of Y Combinator, Paul Graham, where he talks about sort of the maker schedule and the manager schedule, and how makers and managers have very different ways of making their weekly agenda. If you haven't read it, I'll send it to you. I think it's worth reading. I'm actually trying to be on both. So I have 2 maker days where basically I have no meetings, because the premise of the article is that, even one meeting a day can really take a maker who wants to work creatively on a product totally out of the rhythm, and it can just mess up your entire day. So to have really large chunks of time basically without meetings. So are there any learnings, any things? I hear a lot of bike riding, any performance optimization tips on being a great manager that you can share?
I do follow pretty religiously having blocks of time, minimum kind of 2 hours per day, which I get at least 3 or 4 days a week, that are kind of blocked out for me to either do work, to have those kind of creativity sessions, because you just need to go in and do it. I mean, for me, one of the big things is I'm also a musician, and musician is actually so analogous to engineering and the creative pursuits, because instead of physics and math and science as your toolkit, you have scales, modes, progressions, and the whole thing from from a music standpoint, and you come into that creative space, and you have to use those tool sets in a very different way. But the thing that I try to find, if I'm weak in something, I try to find different ways to, I'll say, practice the skill without practicing the skill. So for example, one of the things I was never really good at is reading a script, because my musician's the style is, improv. It's basically kind of jamming with friends and stuff like that. I don't record like very much at all, especially trying to play note for note recordings of what I'm trying to do. And what I realized is that instead of like learning how to memorize scripts, if I just learned how to play these things recorded a little bit more, it actually became a little bit more intuitive, a little bit better for me. And it was a way to kind of practice a skill without it feel like a kind of an onerous skill practice. So that's been one area. And then I think finding and surrounding myself, working with some architects and the like, that just like, hey, throw me a problem every now and then that you're stuck on, because it's so different than the problems I'm stuck on. It just forces your brain to like react and work in a different way. And sometimes they don't have solutions for them, right? Like, ooh, that's a hard one. But other times you're like, wow, what if you solved it like this? And then you just kind of go back and forth, and you're iterating in a completely different space, but one that I think is really exciting, really creative to work in, and just stretch the brain, and this balance of, being expert in what you know, but also being willing to be uncomfortable, kind of finds those boundaries and pushes and pushes and pushes. And then just really being like persistent and just doggedly like, I'm going to work on this until I figure it out. That's probably also one of my bigger strengths, maybe at times a weakness as well.
Fantastic answer. I mean, totally down our alley. I don't know how much you know about sort of our pre-COVID festival that we've done in Berlin, which is very interdisciplinary. So it's always about bringing the creative arts together with the tech community. So, Josh, thank you so much for your time. Really interesting conversation. I wish you all the best for the future, and that hopefully I'll be pinging you once I've bought my first Hyperloop ticket. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.